National Nurses Day. That's
A special occasion in the White House. National Nurses Day is a moment to honor the people on the front lines of the pandemic. Donald Trump is here to say thank you and sign a declaration while the nurses look on.
Here, look. Here, Marty, take that one.
As he turns to the press, a reporter asks a question about the economy. In his answer, Trump turns his fire on China, framing the spread of the coronavirus like a military attack.
This is really the worst attack we've ever had. This is worse than Pearl Harbor. This is worse than the World Trade Center. There's never been an attack like this. And it should have never happened. Could have been stopped at the source. Could have been stopped in China. It should have been stopped right at the source. And it wasn't.
Of course, we're all used to Donald Trump mouthing off. That's his trademark. But this is important. This matters to all of us, whether you live here in Europe or anywhere in the world. The two most powerful countries on Earth are slipping deeper and deeper into a profound form of conflict. Some are even calling it a new Cold War. And just like the coronavirus itself, this has the power to define our age.
From the military to technology, the economy to political influence, the rivalry between the US and China is intensifying in just about every realm of human existence. Now the outbreak of the coronavirus in China and its spread around the world has taken tensions to a new extreme.
I think the China-US relation is probably at a historical low. I mean, since China and the US has established diplomatic ties in the last 4 decades.
The current state is very serious, and it's very dire, I think. We're at a point where bilateral tensions are really, really high.
I think it's going to be a very dangerous year.
And the world is going to have to face up to some very important choices.
Well, our European friends need to decide what they stand for.
We are allies with America, but that does not imply that we just follow the lead of an incapable leader like President Trump, like sheep.
It will be of all of us to realize where our heart is. You know, is it towards business interest or is it towards values? At some point, we will have to make a choice.
Now, one thing in this story that's so important to emphasize is that this clash between the United States and China isn't just about the coronavirus.
The pandemic we're living through right now can seem so all-pervasive, almost as if it's a reset of everything.
But these tensions between the US and China have much deeper roots. So in this video, we're not just going to ask what's going on now. We're going to dig down and find out what lies beneath. And finally, we're going to ask, what's coming next? Are we about to enter into a new Cold War?
January 2020. It's just a few months ago, but it feels like another era. Donald Trump went to Davos and hailed his relations with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Our relationship with China right now has probably never been better. We went through a very rough patch, but it's never, ever been better. My relationship with President Xi is an extraordinary one. He's for China, I'm for the US, but other than that, we love each other.
Trump was buoyant after signing what was being called a Phase 1 trade deal with China, easing tensions amid a long-running trade war that Trump himself had started. And even as the COVID-19 outbreak spread in February, Trump was still flattering Xi Jinping.
China's working very hard. Late last night, I had a very good talk with President Xi, and we talked mostly about the coronavirus. They're working really hard, and I think they're doing a very professional job.
But soon the outbreak hit the United States with full force. New York became one of the worst hotspots in the world, and the Trump administration came under massive fire for failing in its response. At the same time, evidence was mounting that China hadn't been open about the early days of the outbreak, losing crucial time that could have saved lives. And speculation even grew about whether a special laboratory in Wuhan was the source of the virus.
So as the political pressure has intensified on the Trump administration, Donald Trump has seized on China as the true villain of the coronavirus crisis.
China should be held responsible for what they've done. They have hurt the world very, very badly. They've hurt themselves also, but they've hurt the world very, very badly.
For 47 years.
And with the election campaign looming, pro-Trump groups have put out ads attacking China and linking it to his opponent, Joe Biden. The message, don't blame us for what's going on, blame China. The data suggests that it might be effective. 2/3 of Americans have a negative view of China, a figure that's risen higher and higher in recent years. All this is the backdrop to those comments we saw Trump making when meeting those nurses in the White House.
This is worse than Pearl Harbor. This is worse than the World Trade Center. There's never been an attack like this.
China, for its part, has been firing back.
我们反对的是美国等一些国家企图将病毒溯源问题政治化，迫不及待地要搞有罪推定式的。
It's turning into a bitter blame game played by both sides.
One thing that I do think is interesting between in this whole blame China strategy is that the Chinese also have a blame US strategy.
Melissa Chan reported from China for Al Jazeera for several years before her credentials were revoked. She now works for a number of outlets, including DW News Asia.
Some of their diplomats have come out to say and blame the United States as being the ones who created this virus during a military game, international military games that was held in China. They are accusing the Americans of having brought the virus to China, to Wuhan. And so you have this geopolitical spat where both sides are arguing sometimes based on what appears to be unsubstantiated conspiracy theory.
We've been speaking to analysts in both China and the US about this, and of course they have very different perspectives. But there's one thing that they do agree on. Relations have never been this bad.
Well, I think the China-U.S. relation is probably at a historical low. I mean, since China and the U.S. has established diplomatic ties in the last 4 decades.
Wang Huyao heads the Center for China and Globalization think tank in Beijing and has close ties to the Chinese government.
There is a wide, consensus actually among the government officials here in China, among the elite, among the business community, that somehow U.S. is turning their back. It's back on China.
The current state is very serious, and it's very dire. I think we're at a point where bilateral tensions, are really, really high.
Nadège Roland views US-China relations from a transatlantic perspective. She spent 20 years as a China expert at the French Ministry of Defense. Now she's based at a US think tank. She points out that the coronavirus crisis isn't just putting the Trump administration under political pressure, but Beijing too. And that adds to the danger.
If there's a prospect of recession in the next few months, then there's always the possibility that the regime will want to deflect the internal pressure on something else. And the possibility of conflict is not to be dismissed, unfortunately. That would be, of course, very escalatory, and the risks will be enormous.
All this tension already goes way beyond angry statements and tweets. This has real consequences right now, things that could matter in the fight against the coronavirus.
The US pulled funding from the World Health Organization, accusing it of being too cozy with Beijing. It was a dramatic move and an example of how the Trump administration has broken with America's previous global approach to crises like this.
The last pandemic that we had was Ebola in Africa. And at that time, the United States took a leading role internationally to coordinate efforts to push back and to fight against Ebola.
Reinhard Bütikofer is a veteran German member of the European Parliament and leads the Parliament's delegation on China.
Today, there's not even an attempt to show leadership on the part of the United States. China sees that, everybody sees it, and China tries to exploit that.
Meanwhile, the pandemic has exposed America's dependence on China for essential medical supplies. This has fueled talk of a major rethink, a decoupling of America's economy from its deep ties with China.
And Donald Trump has egged this on. In one of his most striking comments so far, he's even raised the prospect of a complete detachment between the US and Chinese economies.
In an interview with the Fox Business Channel, he said we could cut off the whole relationship. Now, if you did, what would happen? We'd save $500 billion.
Trump made no explanation of that figure, but even by his standards, this was a radical thing to suggest. Could the US really cut all ties with China? Well, we'll get to that question later on in the video. First, let's dig down to the roots of the current crisis.
The story begins 40 years ago with this man, Deng Xiaoping. He took power in Beijing after the death of Mao Zedong in the late 1970s and began to develop an economy that had been crippled by decades of communist experiments. Throughout, Deng stuck to a modest approach to China's role in the world outside. Effectively, don't stick your neck out.
Well, I think Deng Xiaoping will be recorded in history as one of the extraordinary figures of the history of the 20th century.
Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd remembers that time. He worked at the Australian Embassy in Beijing in the 1980s.
He took this Maoist wreck, otherwise called China and the Cultural Revolution, and through an internal party coup, took out the Maoist ideologues and instead inserted what's known as a pragmatic economic program domestically and internationally, which turbocharged China's economic growth.
Economic development didn't mean an end to repression. The Tiananmen Square massacre near the end of Deng's time in 1989 brought the condemnation of the world. But under Deng's successors, China's economic growth continued. And with the return of Hong Kong from British rule in 1997, it gained a significant new stepping stone into the world economy.
And you could see the 21st century so far as the incredible story of China's rise to become a global power. But what's really striking is if you look at a timeline of the last 20 years, there's milestone after milestone where China took a step forward and the United States stumbled. In December 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. It was the key moment in becoming part of the world economy.
Joining the WTO provided a massive boost to growth and investment and triggered a boom in low-cost manufacturing as firms from around the world turned to China.
So what was happening in America at the end of 2001?
It was reeling from the 9/11 attacks and launching into 2 decades of war that still haven't fully ended today. Fast forward to August 2008 and China was in the limelight as never before. The Beijing Olympics were like a coming out party for an ever more confident power. Just 3 weeks later, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, intensifying the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The world economy took a huge hit, but the impact was deepest in the West. And for the first time, China's economy played a significant role in powering the world back to recovery.
So you can see these years in the aftermath of the financial crisis as the time when the balance of power between the US and China was shifting quietly but significantly.
The American economy was in deep trouble, and the federal government was borrowing massive amounts of money to keep it afloat. Here too, China played an active role. Within 3 years of the Lehman crash, China more than doubled its holdings of US federal government debt, becoming the biggest foreign lender to the United States at well over $1 trillion. Even some of America's success stories had Chinese DNA. The iPod and iPhone, for instance, were manufactured in China's ever more sophisticated factories. So things were looking pretty good for China when this man became its new leader in 2013, Xi Jinping. He rose to power just as China's economy was overtaking America's in the key measure of purchasing power.
Xi Jinping is an absolutely pivotal figure in this story. His accession to power marked the moment that China really shifted up a gear from that primarily economic development that began a generation earlier under Deng Xiaoping to something much more assertive and much more consequential for the rest of the world.
In one of his first big speeches, he even spoke of a Chinese dream.
必须再接再厉，一往无前，继续把中国特色社会主义事业推向前进，继续为实现中华民族伟大复兴的中国梦而努力奋斗。
This was a confidence to say that China's success was no accident, that it didn't happen despite being an authoritarian power, but because of it. Government advisor in Beijing, Wang Huyao, says that China's track record against its democratic neighbor, India, proves the point.
In the 1980s, China and India was the same level of economic development. Now China is 5 times ahead of India. So China is doing well. China is doing fine. They just wanted the world to, be a bit more accepting on that, a bit more tolerant.
Just a few months into Xi Jinping's time in office, there was another of those moments where you saw America's stumbling just as China moved ahead.
For a time in autumn 2013, the US didn't even have a functioning government. American politics had become so divided that Congress couldn't agree on how to fund basic services, so they simply shut down. The American political system was breaking under intense polarization, the fallout from a decade of war and financial crisis. Around the same time, Xi Jinping was in Jakarta, where he announced China's most ambitious project ever. He called it One Belt, One Road, evocatively named after the historic Silk Road trading route. Belt and Road was a monumental plan to connect the infrastructure of China to the rest of Asia and beyond to Europe and Africa. The message, look at what we've built in China, let's bring that to you. The project let loose hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese investment, particularly in developing countries. It was especially attractive to governments with patchy records on governance and human rights, with the signal funding would come without Western strings attached.
That meant that China wasn't just exporting infrastructure, it was exporting its way of doing things too.
What they're saying, though, is, it worked for us. So you don't have to choose a liberal democracy for your own countries if you don't want to, because our own example proves that you can be somehow like us and be successful too. And not only that, but through the Belt and Road Initiative, we, China, are going to be able to help you grow economically through the distribution of loans or investments. And we're not going to look at your political records or your human rights records or your transparency or your anti-corruption levels in your own country. We're not interested in that.
And that message has found a huge number of takers over the past 7 years, with more than 100 countries joining Belt and Road in one way or another. It's creating a growing bloc of nations, many of which have become highly dependent on China for economic growth and development, what you could call a global sphere of influence.
China wants to pull smaller and weaker countries into its own orbit and create some sort of Sino-centric sphere of influence. What China wants out of those countries is a level of respect, a level of deference, but this deference and respect is not just symbolic. I think it has real concrete implications.
Those implications can be onerous, as Sri Lanka discovered. It's been a hotspot of Belt and Road investment, but as debts to Beijing mounted, it ceded control of a key seaport to China for 99 years. There are fears that similar fates could await governments in other parts of the world. And what's more, that sphere of influence doesn't just have financial implications, they're political too.
Because of this enormous leverage, economic leverage that China has over other countries, none of these countries will, or governments will want to go against China's will. You see, it's not just a symbolic deference. It's also it has a very concrete application onto how China is, acting and behaving, and other countries are basically paralyzed because they don't have any ways to go against it.
So Belt and Road is a potentially huge source of power and influence for China around the developing world. But let's take a look at the map again, because it's not just developing countries that are joining in.
Just last year in Europe, Italy, Greece and Portugal all signed up to the project. Xi Jinping was received to great fanfare as he toured his new partners' capitals, places still feeling the after effects of the 2008 financial crisis. And now the economic crash caused by the pandemic has made them more desperate than ever for sources of growth.
These countries are in the European Union. They're in NATO too, core members of the Western Alliance, now forging closer ties with China.
China's forays into Europe don't stop there. As we saw in a recent video, it's made highly publicized deliveries of supplies to many European countries during the coronavirus crisis, seen as an attempt to patch up its image after the outbreak began on its soil. And in another initiative called 17+1, China's created a platform for cooperation with a swathe of Central and Eastern European countries from the Baltics to the Balkans, most of them young democracies tempted by the prospect of Chinese investment. On the military front, China's been advancing rapidly too. It's been strengthening its foothold in the strategically essential South China Sea. Here, the United States has been pushing back, frequently sending warships through the region to assert its freedom to use the waterways. But in every realm of military power, China continues to advance.
The fundamentals of China's economic power have purchased for it now extraordinary military reach in conventional military capabilities and cyber capabilities, which it didn't have before.
What about political development? Are there any signs that China is opening up politically, as it has done economically? Well, here the answer is a very clear no.
Pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong have only seen Beijing tighten its grip on the territory, raising concerns that it won't honour the agreements signed when it regained control of the former British colony. And in the western region of Xinjiang, the Muslim minority Uyghur population is undergoing repression on an epic scale, with as many as 1 million people subjected to re-education camps. DW has reported on systematic abuses revealed in leaked documents.
Far from opening China's politics up, Xi Jinping has tightened its authoritarian system, and he's consolidated his own power, removing limits so that he could potentially rule for life.
Since Xi Jinping has taken control of all things Chinese in China on the mainland, China has seen what could be described as amounting to a kind of regime change, collective leadership, term limits for the top position, a certain small level of, well, I don't want to say liberty, but allowing civil society to find niches in which it could play an active role, at least addressing human rights issues. All that has vanished.
And as China's global ambitions grow, that commitment to its authoritarian model has more and more implications for the rest of the world.
Xi Jinping doesn't only try to be a global leader, he tries to be a global bully. This leadership obviously finds that if they push hard, they can establish a more China-centric order than would have been conceivable 10, 15, 20 years ago.
So what was happening in the US since we last checked in? Well, those political divisions that we saw forcing a government shutdown back in 2013 have only got deeper and deeper.
The election of Donald Trump in 2016 brought that to its logical conclusion. And while so much attention has focused on whether Russia helped him to win, you could argue that actually his victory was all about China.
I covered that 2016 election as one of DW's US correspondents, and I went to a lot of Donald Trump rallies. And everywhere he went, and every time he spoke, he always talked about China. His views on this are deeply held.
Trump has been remarkably consistent about China for someone who's known for being fairly inconsistent. If you look at his rhetoric in the 1980s, it wasn't China that was the bogeyman, it was Japan. But it's clear that he has a certain view on trade where he believes that certain countries take advantage of the United States and are takers, are exporters to the United States, and have really benefited from American consumers. And what he's done in terms of his rhetoric with China is essentially transfer his point of view from the 1980s when he was talking about Japan and made it a China issue. And you could see that when he was on the campaign trail in 2016. So he can point to the historical past and say, I have been warning you guys about China all along. We need to be tough on China.
So little wonder Trump's trade war with China has been one of the defining features of his presidency so far.
So let's take stock for a moment of where things stood when the coronavirus hit.
In the last 7 years under Xi Jinping, China has become an undisputed economic superpower, and it's rolled out a global sphere of economic and political influence. Its military power is rapidly growing, and far from backing down on its belief in authoritarian government, it thinks it's been proven right, and offers its success as a model to the world. A model that says you don't need democracy to get ahead. Meanwhile, in the US, years of war, financial meltdown, and political dysfunction culminated in the election of Donald Trump, a man who's made it his mission to take the fight to China.
We've ended up with two leaders in the United States and China, which are now distinctly nationalist. President Trump, Make America Great Again, and President Xi Jinping, who has discarded Deng Xiaoping's cautionary advice about hide your strength, bide your time. So therefore, the dynamics of these two leaderships has made the structural factors at work even sharper.
If you look to some people in the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo, for instance, it's tending towards all-out confrontation.
So what now? Is this all pointing to a new Cold War?
It's November 2018. An attack is underway in Karachi, Pakistan. The target, the Chinese consulate in the city. Police blame separatists from the state of Balochistan. There, down on the coast, China is developing one of the most important projects in the Belt and Road Initiative, a giant port complex at the city of Gwadar. The site itself has been the target of attacks too. Gwadar is an absolutely crucial piece of infrastructure for China, a direct foothold in the Arabian Sea, connected all the way to Kashgar in China's Xinjiang region.
Why are militant attacks in Pakistan even relevant to our story? Well, think about it. So far we've been talking about Belt and Road as an economic and political initiative. But the more assets China has out in far-flung parts of the world, the more it's going to want to keep them safe. And that's where Belt and Road takes on more of a military dimension. Nadège Rolland explains.
They're looking at different ways to deal with the security risks. Some of it is, for example, what happened in Pakistan, which is subcontracting the Pakistani army, the Pakistani military forces, specifically to protect the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So you have several thousands of Pakistani soldiers who are devoted to the protection of the workers, the Chinese workers, and the projects along that corridor.
So you already have China subcontracting a special division of Pakistan's army. Looking to the future, former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, foresees a more active role for China's own military in protecting Belt and Road, or BRI for short.
I think one of the things we have to be very careful in monitoring is what now happens with BRI member states and the extent to which China moves to militarize those relationships. For example, both in Southeast Asia and across the so-called string of pearls, that is maritime bases in the Indian Ocean states, particularly in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, but also in Pakistan, and now prospectively in Iran, and already in Djibouti in the Red Sea, where China is beginning to forward deploy naval and air assets.
And these are the sorts of assets where Belt and Road could really turn into a staging ground for Cold War-style confrontation with the United States.
So under those circumstances, if we begin to see an American pushback in those third country theatres, then it's not a large gap between what we now have, which is an emerging, as it were, diplomatic chasm, for that to become a chasm of assuming more military characteristics.
It seems to have so many echoes of the last Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, but there is one fundamental difference between then and now. In the 20th century Cold War, the American and Russian economies had virtually no ties with each other. In the 21st century, between the US and China, that is very different. They do a lot of business together.
The characterization I've given the US-China relationship in the future of the post-COVID order is Cold War 1.5. And the reason I choose that term is because the one differential between the previous Cold War with the Soviet Union and the current estrangement with the People's Republic of China is the degree of economic interconnectedness between China and the US.
That interconnectedness, whether in iPhones or almost any kinds of goods and services, has been a key economic story of the past 2 decades. Decoupling, as the expression goes, would involve massive disruption on both sides.
The 70,000 US company has set up in China and generating 700 to 900 billion US dollar revenue a year in China. For example, GM sells more cars in China than the US, and China's Apple largest market outside US. So decoupling is not that easy.
But some decoupling is already happening. The US has banned American firms from working with the Chinese 5G mobile networks giant Huawei. And as the pandemic drags on, more and more sectors might bring their supply chains back home.
If finance gets hit by the decoupling trend too, that could mean a much bigger break.
That is starting to unravel, not just in trade through the trade wars, not just through technology, where the United States is taking an increasingly restrictive approach, and not just in 5G, but prospectively in financial markets as well. And if the economic ties and bind unravel, then you begin to look at the characteristics of a Cold War we've been through once before.
And Donald Trump is threatening to push down that road of economic decoupling. Remember the interview with Fox Business that we flashed up earlier, where he talked about cutting off the whole relationship with China and said it would even save hundreds of billions of dollars.
You can just imagine that becoming a centerpiece of Trump's re-election campaign this year. Bring back all that business from China to rebuild the US economy post-coronavirus and make America great again. As for China, well, over in Beijing, Wang Huiyao says it's ready for anything.
The US is forcing decoupling. It's going to first hurt US companies. Second, it's going to help China. It's going to help China to thrive on its own. China will eventually develop its own technology and its system. It may slow it down some time, but eventually it will overcome.
This is what a new Cold War could look like, with the US and China severing more and more ties, economic and political, and retreating into their own spheres of influence. The US and its Western allies on one side, and China and Belt and Road on the other. And just like the last Cold War, this could mean that the rest of the world has to decide, which side are you on?
This is a nightmare scenario for Europe in particular. Its economy has become even more interlinked with China than America's has.
The level of economic involvement is just huge. Germany alone exports more to China than the UK, France, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands combined.
To some on the outside, Europe has just been coasting along.
Well, our European friends need to decide what they stand for. Europe's historical policy with engagement with China has been periodically complain about human rights, make as much money as you can, and consign any security policy concerns to the United States and its Pacific allies.
The European Union has started to toughen its tone on China. A year ago, it came out with a new strategy paper that described a three-part relationship with China, one based on partnership, competition, but also systemic rivalry.
The two sides have been preparing for a major summit on investment between Europe and China later this year, one where Europe wanted to demand a more level playing field for European companies doing business in China.
That summit has been thrown up in the air by the pandemic, and there are questions about just how tough Europe will be.
On Huawei, for example, the EU has not followed America's lead with a ban. It's just recommended that member states limit Huawei's access to the most sensitive parts of the 5G network.
Individual European countries are free to take a harder line if they want to. The German MEP Reinhard Bütikofer says that Germany should do so.
Let's check whether, on the basis of national security concerns and technological dependency concerns, it's a smart approach to allow Huawei into the 5G network. And I have long come to the conclusion that this would not be smart.
But Huawei is now trying to sweeten the deal, saying it will build a 5G equipment factory in France. And as Beijing continues to nurture relationships with European states, there are doubts that Europe will be able to unite around tough decisions involving China.
This is a way for Beijing to be able to make sure that Europe is divided. And because Europe, the EU is based on the need for consensus before you take any decision at the EU level, you need just one country not to agree on this consensus to be able to discard or to disregard a joint posture. In societies and countries where we still haven't fully emerged from the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, these economic opportunities that China is putting on the table can be quite vital. And this is an enormous leverage that Beijing has on the decision of these countries. So you don't want to upset or to anger China by voting against or by voting for a measure that would limit the Chinese investments in Europe.
And here's the thing, public opinion here in Europe is also pretty divided.
A new opinion poll in Germany shows that Germans are almost equally split between those who want closer ties with America and those wanting to put China first.
That's an extraordinary result when you consider the depth of the historic relationship between the US and Germany. But it could get even worse. Donald Trump has made repeated threats to open up a new trade war between the US and the European Union. So that's where Europe finds itself right now, facing the possibility of a new Cold War between a difficult America and an encroaching China. What should it do?
As Europeans, I think we're very interested in free trade, and we're very interested in keeping all the lines open and transparent. But how is that going to be still possible in the years to come if China continues to go in the same direction that it has taken for the last 5 years, where you see an increasing closing down, an increasing repression, an increased aggression. I don't know. It will be of all of us to realize where our heart is. Is it towards business interest or is it towards values? At some point, we will have to make a choice. I really believe so.
We are allies with America, but that does not imply that we just follow the lead of an incapable leader like President Trump, like sheep. We don't believe in restructuring international governance according to the age-old concept of big power confrontation. We insist as Europeans to base international relations on the rule of law, international rule of law, and multilateralism. So, and of course, we give much more relevancy to international challenges that would benefit a lot from Chinese contributions. President Trump has never thought about a Chinese contribution to the fight against climate change because in his mind, climate change is a Chinese hoax.
And speaking out from Australia, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd says it's time for like-minded nations to get together and try at least to limit the fallout of whatever's to come.
I would, if I were the mainstream Europeans, team up with comparable countries of parallel clout in the international system to support financially and diplomatically these essential institutional pieces of machinery of the system of global governance while the elephants continue to rampage in the living room.
This has partly started happening already. The EU led an online fundraising effort to coordinate work to find a coronavirus vaccine. China only sent a junior delegate, and the US didn't even take part. But Kevin Rudd says it is essential to keep multilateral cooperation alive, or at least on life support.
Keeping the institutions of global governance afloat and functioning to the greatest extent possible until we re-achieve a form of either strategic equilibrium with China and the United States, or alternatively, a new era of détente is arranged, which defines the areas in which a Cold War will be conducted and not conducted.
This is the new world that's appearing on the horizon, a world remade not just by the coronavirus, but by a new type of Cold War.
Whoa. Whoa.